All right, welcome back. Let me start by saying that this video is not going to prepare you to go out and get a job at a body shop, nor is it going to prepare you to start doing body work and paint on the side, for money. This video is for the person that wants to try to paint their own car. Maybe you've been watching some videos on some cheap DIY paint jobs, stuff like that, and you got a few dings, maybe some door dings, maybe a little bit of hail damage, something like that, and you want to fix that stuff so that your new paint job will look as good as it can look. So I'm just going to start with the basics. I've been doing body work on this. This is our budget drag car. If you've been watching the videos, it's a SN95 model Mustang. Anyway, we're not going to paint this car. At least that's not the plan. The plan is to vinyl wrap it, but there's a good bit of body work that needed to be done, and so I want to do that, get the car in primer, and then we'll wrap it from there. I may change my mind. We may end up painting it. So I saved a couple of dents just to do a video on. The first one that I'm going to do is real simple. It's just a little, it looks like hail damage, or somebody dinged it with a ball peen hammer or something. I don't know. But it's on top of this door. Let's take a look at it. Okay, so here's our dent. It's a little too deep to be hail damage. It definitely got hit with something. But as far as dents go, I would say this is kind of the best case scenario. The reason I say that is because there is no cracking of the paint. It's just the metal is mashed in and the paint didn't crack at all. So that makes this repair a lot easier. Okay, so what I'm going to be using is a glazing putty. The particular brand is U-Pole. This is my first time using it, and I just got it because it's cheap and I could get it at O'Reilly's instead of a paint supply store. There's different types of putties. As far as I'm aware, it's kind of all the same thing. It's just different names. You've got glazing putty, finishing putty, polyester putty. I think it's all the same. The biggest thing, you just want to make sure that it's a two-part system, meaning that you've got a hardener for it. Back in the day when they first came out with putty, there wasn't a hardener. It was just a one-part system. And when you sand that, when you finish it off, it may be fine for now. But what's going to happen is over time, it's going to shrink, it's going to move around, and then you're going to be able to see through your paint where you actually did your repair. So using a two-part system kind of keeps that from happening. Okay, so the first step is to clean the repair area. Now I'm using this RM Pre-Clean 0900. It's a wax and grease remover, and you don't have to use that. You can use any brand. Just make sure you get a wax and grease remover. You want to make sure you clean that surface real good because you don't want to be sanding contaminants into it. Now I'm going to be applying that with just some regular paper towels. Yes, they do make professional grade paper towels that cut down on static. And yes, you are supposed to be using rubber gloves. I don't have any gloves. I'm out, and I want to get this done today. So just pretend I'm wearing some. So I got two paper towels. One, I'm going to put a little bit of wax and grease remover on, and I'm going to wipe this area down. Then I'm going to take my dry paper towel, and I'm going to dry that off. Now, before we can apply our putty, we've got to sand the area with something to give the putty something to bite into, something to attach to. Now, whenever I'm doing filler work, I always want to finish that off with a 180 grit. And before you spray your primer, anything coarser than that, I know some people will finish their filler work with 80 and then spray primer. The problem with that is not all primers are the same, and some may be able to handle 80 grit scratches just fine. Others, what's going to happen is over time, as the solvents cure, or as that primer cures and the solvents escape from that, it's going to shrink into those 80 grit scratches, and you will be able to see it. After your paint job may look great, and then give it some time, and that primer is going to start shrinking into those 80 grit scratches, and you're going to be able to see, if you get in the right light, you'll be able to see exactly where you did your sanding. So it's important to get that finished off with 180 grit. Now, the cool thing about polyester putty is it sands pretty easy, so you can work it completely with 180. You don't even have to touch anything coarser than that, which makes your finishing work much easier. So I've got a small piece of 180 grit, and I'm going to sand that area now, and then I'll mix up some putty and wipe that on. Now, if you got a spot that the 180 won't completely get into, you can take a red scuff pad and hit that. A red pad is equivalent to 400 grit, and that's fine. Putty will adhere to 400, and you can spray over 400. So, I mean, you can apply primer over 400 is what I'm saying. Okay, now we've got that sanded. Let's take some wax and grease remover and wipe that off. So to mix the putty, I'm going to be using a mixing board. There's two types of mixing boards. One is a hard plastic that requires you to clean it with solvent after every use. And then there's ones like these. That's a stack of paper. It's just a tear away. So once this is filled up, you tear it off and you've got a clean sheet to work with. Some people will use cardboard, but I was taught, you know, that was a no-no. The cardboard will absorb whatever chemicals are in the putty or Bondo, and these are supposed to have some sort of coated paper to where they won't do that. If that, you know, whether or not that's true, I don't know. It may just be a marketing gimmick. I'm not sure. But I just like using these. Now, spreader, this is just a plastic spreader. This is a 4-inch. That's kind of your standard size. They do make a 6-inch. I don't like even on big areas. I do better with the 4. But for doing small areas, I'll just take and cut them down, and that's what I'm going to be using. Okay, so we're not going to need a lot. I'm not going to use the middle of the board since I'm just mixing up very little. I'm going to start at the corner. That way I can, if I need to do another wipe, I'll have plenty of space, and I can get multiple uses out of this one sheet. Okay, that should be more than enough. Now your hardener, your ratio is about 2% of the hardener to the putty. Now, one thing you want to make sure you do, you want to knead it because this stuff will separate. So, I don't know if that's 2%, but that's probably close enough. Now, some people, when they mix putty or filler, they like to stir it. I don't like doing that. I like just folding it over on itself. I don't know. Everybody's got their own way of doing it. This is how I like to do it. You want to mix till you get a consistent color. You don't want a marble look. You'll have some spots that are harder than others. Some spots that don't cure out completely. So you want to make sure that you get a consistent color or a uniform color. And then if you have to come back and wipe a little more on your next batch that you mix up, you want to try to put the same amount of hardener because you want to try to match those colors. You want those as close to the same as possible. If it's got too much hardener, your new batch will be harder to sand than your old batch, and vice versa. If it doesn't have enough, it'll sand too easy. Okay, let's wipe this. That's pretty deep. It's probably going to require two wipes. that's okay. Now to clean the spreader, you know, some people will just let it sit there and harden, and then once it cures out, then that putty will just peel off, or the filler will peel off. Problem is when that cures, or as it cures, it goes through a heat cycle, and it gets pretty hot, and it'll actually warp up your spreader and will become wavy. And it's hard to make a nice wipe if it's wavy. I keep a little Ziploc container with thinner in it. And just put it in some, dunk it in some thinner, take a paper towel, and wipe right off. Also, I've seen people take and let the filler cure on there, and then they'll take their knife, their pocket knife, and scrape it off. You don't want to do that, because then that puts a bunch of gouges and stuff in your spreader. And again, it makes it hard to get a smooth wipe of filler. So now for a sanding block, I'm just using a paint paddle or a stir stick. Now you can get these from a paint supply store, you can get them from a hardware store, whatever. The main thing you want to make sure of is whenever you hold it up and look down it, you want to make sure it's straight. If it's got any kind of waves, then toss it. It's not a good one. Normally, yeah, these are longer. And anyway, I've cut it down because I don't need anything like that. I'm going to be sanding this with 180, so just going to wrap this around the stick. Just want to make sure it's nice and tight. Okay, now we're ready to sand. When it comes to sanding, technique is very important. That's what's going to make your repair straight. You don't want to go, say, back and forth like this, or just up and down, or whatever. You know, you don't want to work in up and side to side and up and down motions, okay? You want a combination of those. You want to hold your block parallel to the ground, and then you want to move front to back in an angled motion, okay? And then you don't want to just do this. You don't want to just do this. Now you need to swap directions and go the other way. So we're moving at a 45 in two different directions. Let me zoom in here so you can see. See how this area here is still a brighter yellow than this out here? It's because this has not been touched by the sandpaper yet. That is still low. So that means we're gonna need another wipe. So to do that, we're gonna take a piece of 180 again, and then we're just gonna sand that. We're going to mix up some more. Now, when I wiped this the first time, I could have just really piled it in there and built it up completely the first time. But what happens, or what you run the potential of happening, is you'll trap air in places, which will create little pinholes. And you may not see those at first, but after it's painted and on down the road, those pinholes could show back up. And you don't want that. If you've gone through all the trouble and spent all the money to paint your car, you really don't want little stuff like that showing up down the road. run your hand across it, make sure you don't feel anything, make sure everything feels uniform. And that is ready for primer. All right, let's move on to something a little more significant. Now, at some point in its life, this door had taken a pretty good shot, and it was really caved in, and in fact, it was bad enough to warrant getting another door, which would have been the easiest thing to do. But, you know, even our local salvage yard, a used door was 125 bucks. And if you're trying to, you know, build yourself something on a budget, that's $125 that could go towards something else. The initial damage had actually cracked the paint. Now, there's inner structure and everything, and it made it impossible to get in there with a hammer and a dolly to get this straightened out. I had to actually use a hydraulic ram to get it pushed out. Now, doing that also further cracked the paint. And then once I got it pushed out to about where it needed to be, I got in there with the dolly and did as much hammer and dolly work as I could. It's not perfect. I mean, it's okay. It's still pretty messed up. But what I'm getting at is we're going to have to wipe this area. Now, it's more than what we can fix with just putty. Putty is too thin. So we're going to have to use some body filler, plastic filler, aka Bondo. I'm not going to go into the history of Bondo or plastic filler on this video. Maybe I'll do a video in the future about it. I don't know. But anyway, in short, Bondo is just a brand. Okay, it kind of, and that name just kind of stuck. About like all string trimmers are referred to as weed eaters, and in the South we refer to all sodas as Cokes. Same thing. Now, when the paint is cracked like this, you've got to strip it back, okay? And this is where we're going to get into some controversy. Okay, so the general rule of thumb is if you've got a white body filler, you do not wipe body filler on paint. Putty is okay, but not body filler. So what you would do is just completely strip the repair area down to the metal, wipe your body filler and work that. And if you needed to kind of blend those into your paint, then you could skim with some putty and sand all that and then prime it. The thought behind that is supposedly the body filler would react with the paint. Then the manufacturers came back and said, you can wipe on paint if it's the original OEM paint. If not, if the panel had been repainted at some point in its life, then you could not wipe on top of that. Again, because it would react. I don't know. In the body shops I've worked in, that's been the practice of just stripping it down to the metal and wiping it. Now, some people say that that's false. You can wipe on top of paint just as long as you've got it sanded good. And of course, anywhere you've got cracked paint or chips or anything like that, you want to make sure you get all that stuff off. Now, if you've seen any of my earlier videos, I'm not in the collision world. I'm in the restoration and customization world. Okay, so we do things completely different. We strip everything down to the metal, all right? Then we spray an epoxy primer, and that's what we do our filler work off of, is off of the epoxy primer. The reason we do that is because the epoxy primer, it seals the metal, so it's not gonna rust. It's protected, and it etches into it, okay? So it bites into it, it's not just gonna peel off. It's there, it has bonded, it is mechanically bonded to the metal. Now, on the collision side of things, they don't worry about the epoxy primer. They don't do that, it takes too long. They strip it, they wipe it, they work it. Then it goes to the paint shop where it gets primed. Okay, now this is gonna get complicated. I'm gonna do my best to explain it and to not be boring, okay? All right, so epoxy primers and black e-coats, that's if you buy a replacement panel and it comes in a black coating, that's the e-coat. Okay, there's a test that they perform to make sure that the epoxy or e-coat meets a certain standard, okay? And what they'll do is they'll take that panel, they'll scratch an X in it, they'll blast it with salt for 500 hours, and they see how far the damage goes, okay? And it's got to be within a certain parameter. I don't know what that is, but it's got to be within a certain parameter. Okay, as long as it passes that test, then it's good to go. All right, now your filler manufacturers have started adding something that will pass that 500-hour corrosive test, okay? So now your filler manufacturers are claiming that you don't have to worry about putting any kind of epoxy or anything like that. You can just strip the bare metal, you can wipe it on it, and it's protected. Here's the problem, and I'm not just, you know, talking out of my ass here, okay? This is a BASF rep that we deal with on a regular basis, has told us that they are starting to see issues in collision shops with the fillers. And what's happening is anywhere they've stripped down to the metal, they've wiped their filler, then on down the road, that area is starting to bubble up. And when they strip that off to see what's happening, it's actually rusted in between the metal and the filler. The question is, why is that happening? The theory right now is when filler cures, it gets really hot, okay? There's a chemical reaction and it gets really hot. And the theory is that heat is creating condensation. And that is what is causing the rust. Now, in this paint rep told us that in their shops that they deal with that are restoration, custom shops like us, that use epoxy, they're not having that issue because that epoxy has that metal protected. Now, I said all that to say this. I don't know exactly what to tell you to do on this. I'm going to tell you what I'm going to do, okay? I'm going to strip this back and make sure I get all my cracked and chipped paint off. Then I'm going to take a DA and I'm going to sand my area with 80 grit. And then I'm going to mix up some filler and I'm going to wipe on it. Is that the best thing to do? I don't know, but that's what I'm doing. And this isn't, you know, this isn't a classic. This isn't a six-figure show car. We're going drag racing, man. So if you're watching this, you're probably just trying to, you're probably trying to fix your own car, and you're in the same boat. You're not building a show car, and you're going to try to paint your car yourself, and you need to do it as economically and efficiently as possible. And so that's what we're doing. Now we're gonna mix this up some filler. I am using the Bondo brand. This stuff will separate, so it's a good idea to stir it before you dip any out. I like to always try to keep my stick clean. Don't want to be using a dirty stick. Now the mixing ratio on this, same thing with the hardener, okay? Gotta knead it. Now, the mixing ratio with this is for every golf ball size filler, you need 1 inch, a 1-inch line of hardener. Now I'm not going to worry about trying to get it fixed with just one wipe. I just want to get started. Just want a thin layer. Don't want a thick layer. Like we talked about, a thick layer will create pinholes, and we want to avoid pinholes if at all possible. So just want to get a thin wipe to get us in the ballpark. And if we got to come back and do a second, we will do a second. Okay, to sand this, I'm going to be using a hard rubber block. If you don't want to go buy a block, you can use a piece of a stir stick like we did on the putty, or a block of wood, just whatever. If you got something flat, that'll work. As far as something like, if you're dealing with a concave surface like this, they do make round blocks, or you can use a piece of PVC pipe. In fact, this is a piece of shoe molding that I had left over from remodeling the laundry room. So, and that works pretty good. So anyway, all right, I'm starting with 80 grit. Now, some people like to start with a really coarse grit, like a 36 or a 40 grit. I don't like to do that. It's puts a really harsh scratch in the panel, and it's just more work to remove it, because remember, we've got to finish it to 180 before we can prime it. So 80 cuts the new fillers are pretty easy to sand, and 80 grit cuts that just fine. So I just start with 80 and then I finish with 180. But we've got to get it shaped before we can even talk about 180. So again, we keep the block parallel to the ground, and we're going to move in a diagonal fashion. Okay, don't do this. Don't do this. That's not going to get it straight. We've got to move at a diagonal fashion both ways in order to get that panel straight. Okay. Now, when you're using a rubber block, this thing has some flex to it. Okay, so you don't want to press. If you press, then the block could deform and would make your repair wavy. Something like a wooden block or whatever works a lot better, or even like an acrylic block, that works pretty good. That works even better. But I mean, a rubber block is fine, but again, don't press. Just kind of let it glide over it. I like to make a few passes in that direction, then I'll swap directions. You can see our highs are getting sanded. You can see where our lows are at. Okay, I wanted to zoom in and show you something important. Now, visually, you can see that these areas here have not been touched by the sandpaper. So they're obviously low. They're going to need another wipe. You can see here that these areas have blended out pretty well. Now, if you'll notice right here, there's still a filler edge that hasn't been touched by the sandpaper, and here. Now, visually, it looks like this area needs to be sanded more, and that'll straighten out. But that's not the case. See, the real trick to doing filler work is developing develop in your hand. You got to get a feel for it. Your hand will tell you what your eyes can't see. Now, when you first start doing this, your hand's going to feel the difference between the panel and the filler that you wiped, and it's going to tell you that, oh, this is real hot, but that's not the case. After a while, you develop a feel for it, and you can tell exactly what's going on. Feeling of it, I can actually feel that this area here is still low, and so is this. That's still low from whatever, you know, whatever hit the door. So actually, we need to wipe, when we wipe this area again, we need to carry it further out to take care of these lows. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take some sandpaper. I'm going to sand these edges back. I'm going to kind of feather edge those edges back, and then I'll mix up some more filler. Oh, and I'll sand this area here too. You don't want to wipe on top of unsanded filler. So sand these, I'll blend these out, and then I'll re-wipe. So I finished blocking with 80, and now I've moved on to 180. Now, as this filler work gets more refined, your hand will be able to pick up on more details of the panel. It'll give you a better picture of what's going on. With a coarser grit, you can only tell so much, but as it gets sanded finer, your hand can pick up on any little waves or whatever you might have missed. Now, depending on what shows up, as I was saying, I may be able to just sand with 180 and then it's ready for primer. Maybe some pinholes show up, even though I've tried to avoid that, but that doesn't mean that they still won't show up. But if some pinholes show up, I may have to wipe those with putty. If there's some little whoop-de-doos or whatever, I may have to do a skim coat of putty over the whole thing and reblock it with 180. I don't know. I'll see as I continue to sand. Also, when you're blocking, if you're dealing with a style line like this, you don't want to run your block over the line. Actually, that'll move your line around, and you want to make sure you get to you want to make sure you get down at the end and take a look down it and see what it looks like. Couple little pinholes there. Little chip there in the paint there. So let me get a little putty mixed up. I'll get those wiped. Okay, so I've got it all sanded with a 180. Now, this style line, I've got it straight, but it's really sharp. So what we need to do is just take just a loose piece of 180 grit, and then without a block, just with your hand, just pass over the peak of that, just a little bit, just very lightly, just to take the sharpness off. Now, that panel is ready to be prepped for primer. So at this point, we're ready to spray primer. I'm not going to get to that in this video. I could probably do a 2 or 3 part series just on spray and primer, but I'll do a video on that. Maybe not next. I'll try to do it next, but if not, it'll be soon. Yeah, so that's it. Hope you got something from it. Hope that kind of points you in the right direction, and don't forget to subscribe, or at least please consider it, and I'll see you in the next one.